At the time of recording, Bitcoin is trading at roughly 30,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. It's exchanging at different rates in different countries because different countries have different numbers of their own political currency units. But here in the US, where I'm from, Bitcoin's roughly $30,000. Except it's not really. It's not really $30,000. And the reason it's not $30,000 is because Bitcoins don't actually exist. And the reason they don't exist is because we deceive ourselves. We have a tendency to lie to ourselves. Our brains tend to manipulate things. And so because we manipulate things, the Bitcoins don't exist. So what on earth am I talking about? Well, obviously I'm a Bitcoin fan. I'm pro-Bitcoin. I like Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin. I'm going to continue owning Bitcoin. But what most people don't realize, even many Bitcoiners, is that they don't really exist. Yes, Bitcoin exists. The protocol exists, the miners exist, the people like me that own the Bitcoin, we exist. But the Bitcoins themselves don't really exist because really they're only satoshis, or only sats. It's commonly said there'll never be more than 21 million Bitcoin, and while this is true, Bitcoin is just a construct. See, in Bitcoin's code, it is not at 21 million Bitcoins, it is 2.1 quadrillion sats. Now, most people don't know what sats are. See, a Bitcoin has divisibility, has infinite divisibility. And what is divisible in it are the sats. There are 100 million satoshis, 100 million sats within each Bitcoin. In the same way that when we talk about the dollar doesn't really exist. It's just the cents that exist. And then nickels are just 5 cents, and dimes are 10 cents, quarters 25 cents, and dollars are just 100 cents. And we call it the dollar when really it's the cents that are the smallest unit of the dollar system. In the same way, satoshis are the bedrock for Bitcoin, the network, for Bitcoin, the protocol, and not Bitcoins themselves. Why is this? Why is it actually more complicated, more convoluted than just having it be straight up Bitcoins? The reason for that is because back when Bitcoin was initially launched in 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto, and it was trading for literally nothing for a very long period of time, actually. Most people are surprised with how long Bitcoin did not have an exchange rate until finally it had an exchange rate of 6 cents per Bitcoin. Now, if you remember, there are 100 million Satoshis per Bitcoin. So what is 6 cents divided by 100 million? It's a very, very small number. And that's exactly why in the old days, in the ancient days of Bitcoin's history, people talked in terms of Bitcoin. They bought in terms of tens of Bitcoin, hundreds of Bitcoin. The first transaction was 10,000 Bitcoin for a couple of pizzas. And so the reason we chose this construct of Bitcoins being 100 million sats is because it was easier. It was easier to do, it was easier to talk about, it was easier to communicate with each other back then. What rewards were, what payments were, it was more efficient for people to communicate with. You know, back then people could get 3, 5, 10 Bitcoin simply from faucets or simply from people giving them out for free. It's a lot easier to tell someone, hey, I'm going to give you 5 Bitcoin at, let's say, $5 a piece, versus I'm going to give you 500 million sats for a total of $5. You know, at that time, it was much more in line with our brains, much more in line with our hardware up here inside of our skulls, that it made more sense to us, it made more intuitive sense. That, oh, okay, a Bitcoin's roughly 6 cents. I have a psychological understanding of what a cent is, and therefore, okay, if a Bitcoin is 6 cents, or $1, or $5, I have some mental grounding for what that looks like. And if you have that communication be, oh, it's 10 million this, or 100 million that, or 500,000 that, when you get to numbers that big, it's hard for us to understand. And so that's why people communicate in that way. And now we're in this weird middle period where Bitcoin has increased in price quite a bit. Ooh, that's quite bright. Bitcoin's increased in price quite a bit. It's went from 6 cents to a couple dollars, or $30 or so. Then it crashed back down to $2, roughly 94%. Skyrocketed again up to $1,100, $1,200 or so. Crashed again, $200, $300, up and down, perpetually with 50%, 80% drops. Continually, now, like I said, we're roughly $30,000 per Bitcoin, or more accurately stated, 30,000 US dollars per 100 million satoshis, or perhaps even more correctly stated is that we're talking about 3 million cents per 100 million satoshis. I think I have that right. But see, when you get to that point where we're talking millions of this or millions of that, It doesn't make sense. And so we oversimplify. Our brains oversimplify to talk in terms of Bitcoin and dollars, when really we're talking in terms of sats and cents. I think a good metaphor for this is how we educate kids about the solar system. We have all these cute little models of Jupiter and Earth and Saturn and Mars. We have all these little diagrams, but really none of them are true. They're all kind of made up. None of them exist. They're all a lie. And it's a useful lie. It's a useful oversimplification because it helps people understand that it helps people understand the concept without getting into all the minutia and all the simplistic things that you simply can't describe to a first grader. You can't describe even to a fifth grader. Solar system is very complex. You literally cannot have a visual model that a human brain can wrap its head around. There are plenty of famous videos online of people taking real life scale models of the solar system, or like a pea is the Earth, or baseball is the Earth or something, and they model it out over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of miles to the closest planets or the closest stars. And that's why we oversimplify, because our brains are not designed to see across that far of space. We inherently can't comprehend space that long. And likewise, when we're talking about 100 million sats, we can't count that high. I mean, we can technically, but none of us have anything to base that on. We can call Bitcoin a couple dollars because we understand 1, 2, 3, 4, but when we get to 10 million, 250 million, 87,000, all those numbers are difficult for us to understand. And so at that time, it was useful for people to talk in terms of Bitcoins back when a single Bitcoin was much, much cheaper. But now we're in this weird middle period where a single Bitcoin is much more expensive than what most people can afford, but likewise, it's still a little too early for people to think about in terms of sats, because roughly right now, let's see, it would be about 3,500 sats per US dollar. So every dollar, that's 3,500 sats. And again, there's 100 million sats per Bitcoin. And so that's still difficult for us to think about. You go to a store, you get a $5 drink, it's like, oh, well, that's gonna be 15,000 sats. It's still difficult for us to do. And so I find it fascinating, I find it very interesting that we're in this weird historical period where we can't really talk in terms of Bitcoins, but we also can't really talk in terms of sats, because Bitcoin has become so expensive that a single Bitcoin is, the price of a down payment of a house. But likewise, sats are not expensive enough, Bitcoin's not expensive enough that we can talk and communicate in terms of sats very easily. So I just find that personally fascinating. I think it's going to be a quirk of history. I think in the future, most people will know of Bitcoin as in Bitcoin, the total network, and they won't talk in terms of Bitcoins, because most people will never own a whole Bitcoin. In fact, most people will never own a tenth of a whole Bitcoin, or perhaps even 1% of a whole Bitcoin. People really don't understand how scarce this thing is, or how few 21 million is. Again, that's the useful oversimplification that there are 21 million Bitcoin, but it's actually something we can kind of grasp. It's much easier to grasp than 2.1 quadrillion. We know there are billions of people in the world, so when you say 21 million, it's like, oh, okay. So there's way fewer Bitcoins than total people in the world. You think about the number of houses. Okay, there are a couple billion houses in the world. Okay, Bitcoins are much more scarce. And so it is useful. It's not quite there, but eventually in the future, I think most people will be talking in terms of sats. Like, oh, this is going to cost 100 sats, or this is going to cost, 10,000 sats, or 500 sats, or 12 sats, or whatever. And I think the funny thing is that in a long enough time horizon, we'll eventually have to denominate those sats in a tenth of a sat, 100th of a sat, 1,000th of the sat even. Because keep in mind, again, satoshis are the base unit. The last epoch of Bitcoin, which is every 4-year period of the halving, from 2136 to 2140, that's going to have a 1 sat block reward. Oops, excuse my little tree friend over there. But it has that, and so if the whole issuance of the Bitcoin network is 1 sat, or as it's often said, 37 sats, or a couple decades earlier, or this and that and the other, really we're going to have to denominate in fractions of a sat, because that's going to be the entire global block reward. Well, I mean, plus transaction fees, of course. But it's fascinating to me too, because I think in 100 years, most people will not be talking in terms of Bitcoins. Oh, did you see that Bitcoin is now trading for $2.5 trillion or whatever, or $300 quintillion or whatever, I mean, depending on what currency we're talking about and if those even exist. And who knows? It's way far into the future, and that's part of my point, that we've less in common with the future than the past. After a certain point, it's simply incalculable how many political currency units it will take to acquire Bitcoin or sats. So really, it's useless predicting that far into the future. but which is crazy to think about. But anyway, I think it's going to be interesting in 100 years when people are talking in terms of sats. Like, oh, do you see a sat is now, 300,000 political currency units of this nation, or this is that. It's fascinating. I think people will look back on their history books, if books even still exist, or obviously they'll still exist, but if people learn from history books, I don't know, 100 years, a lot could change. But anyway, it's going to be interesting. People look back in history and like, wow, people used to talk about, oh, Bitcoin hit $30,000. Wait, what? So what's a big? Oh, it's 100,000 or 100 million satoshis. I think people have trouble understanding that because, again, it's just a conceptualization. It's something people arbitrarily decided. A Bitcoin could have been 10,000 sats or 10 billion sats, but they chose 100 million just for simplicity. That's what made sense to them, and it has worked out well thus far. But ultimately, what's the problem? Why do we do this? Again, it's unit bias, and I think that's one of the major things people need to understand when they're learning about Bitcoin, when they're buying Bitcoin, is that you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. Because again, the Bitcoin doesn't really exist. If you want to take $30,000 and smash buy a whole Bitcoin because you think that's the minimum you have to buy, it's like, no, you can buy with a single dollar. You can buy 3,500 real Bitcoins, aka sats, with a single dollar. It's infinitely divisible, and right now sats are the smallest unit, or at least most commonly smallest unit for Bitcoin. And I think unit bias is far deeper a problem than just needing a better way to communicate efficiently. I think there's also a psychological bias to be for something or against something. See, most other digital currencies and cryptocurrencies and tokens, or whatever you want to call them, unregistered securities, no matter what you want to call them, scams, no matter what you want to call them, they issue more tokens than Bitcoin. And I think one of the main reasons they do that is to hijack that unit bias in humans. With let's say Litecoin, there's 84 million Litecoin, or with Ethereum there's 110 million ETH, or with other tokens there's billions, tens of billions, and with the complete garbage scam ones that are just or Ponzi's, then we're talking trillions, tens of trillions, or perhaps even quadrillions of tokens on their network, quote unquote. And I think they do that to prey upon our idea of, oh, it can go up. If my little digital token that's made up is at 25 cents right now, and Bitcoin went to $30,000, oh, well, if I buy 100 tokens at 25 cents, it goes to $30,000, I'll be a multi-millionaire. Look at me, I'm so special. And to be fair, we do that with stocks too. Like, oh, Apple stock is so expensive, or oh, Tesla stock is so expensive, I'll just smash buy a bunch of this other stock because their shares are only $10 or $12 or $20 or whatever, versus these companies where their shares are thousands of dollars. And again, that's unit bias. So it's nothing new with Bitcoin, it's nothing new with the digital asset market. It's true with stocks as well, it's true with political currencies as well. I mean, a funny thing to do would be to look at Berkshire Hathaway's stock price. I don't know what their stock price is right now, but it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why? Because they never split. They never split. They just let their stock price keep going up and up and up, and it seems like their company is much more valuable because their stock price is hundreds of thousands versus other companies where we're talking hundreds, tens, or thousands. But in reality, it's not the price of the stock that makes the company valuable. It's the total market cap. It's the total value of the company that's then subdivided into the stock. And so in some ways, I think companies avoid stock splits because it makes their stock seem higher psychologically. And this is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. People trade based on psychological numbers. Every order of magnitude you go up, every additional number you add onto a price, it crosses a psychological threshold. That's why I say Bitcoin's going to 100,000, a million, or 10 million, because psychologically it gets people to click, it gets people to engage, and therefore consider the points they have to offer. But likewise, on the contrary, sometimes people divide their stocks. They split their stocks more and more and more to make it seem like their stock is cheaper, is like it's a better price. Typically, this is why you see retail stocks having a much smaller price versus more traditional stocks having a much larger price. Is because the people that are retail, the people that are not thinking these things through, and the people that think the value of a company is based on the price of the stock and not the total market cap or the total value of the stock in a whole, they're more allured in by that. And so ultimately, what's the takeaway? I think the takeaway is to understand that really, when we talk about an infinite number of political currency units divided by 21 million Bitcoin, there's multiple things wrong with that. Number one, the equation doesn't actually add up. rationally, because if you divide an infinite number by a finite number, you still get an infinite number. So it's not technically true, number one. Number two, there's not really 21 million Bitcoins because, number three, Bitcoins don't really exist, and it's actually infinity divided by 2.1 quadrillion, but it's not actually 2.1 quadrillion because it doesn't add up exactly, precisely to 2.1 quadrillion. It's actually a few thousand short of 2.1 quadrillion. That's just how the math works out, just how the equation works out. But for now, we have to educate people about Bitcoin with this useful lie, or this useful oversimplification, let's say, in the same way you model a solar system. We have to talk in terms of Bitcoin. We have to talk in terms of these things because that's what helps people understand that, oh, there's only 21 million of these. That means, you know, if there are 60 million millionaires, I should probably get a third of a Bitcoin, because if this thing takes off, most millionaires will not even be able to buy a third of a Bitcoin. That makes sense to us. If we say there's only 2.1 quadrillion, it's like, it's difficult for us to understand how many satoshis 60 million millionaires could buy if there's quadrillions or trillions of them or whatever. And so ultimately, I think this is important for people to understand, both in the present and the future, that you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin to start buying Bitcoin, number one. Number two, you have to keep in mind your unit bias. And this is why people have trouble understanding that Bitcoin could go to 10 million, 50 million, 100 million, and more. Probably not for a while, but perhaps sooner than people think. It's because, for example, the United States government's total national debt in 1980 was less than $1 trillion. Today, our interest expenditure is $1 trillion. The total national debt of the United States has increased by 500,000x in the last 160 years or so, roughly that, a little bit more actually, but 500,000x. And now we've gone from millions to billions to trillions. Soon we'll be in the quadrillions in a decade or so, you know, more or less, depending on what actually happens in the world. But that's where we're going. And as we create more currency units, our mental peg of what things are worth changes. Back in the day, you could buy something for a nickel. You could buy a house for a few $1,000s. Now, it's much more because our unit bias has shifted. Instead of talking about a gallon of gas being a quarter, 25 cents, now we say it's a few dollars. Why? Do we not say it's 300 or 3,000 cents, or that's, you know, why do we not say that we're buying a house for 100,000 cents or a million cents or a billion cents? It's just because it's simpler. And I think it's important for people to understand that when you are buying and holding, that when you're trying to understand when Bitcoiners are talking about the future value of Bitcoin priced in terms of political currency units, when we're talking about sats versus Bitcoin, you have to understand that many of these things are mental constructs, and ultimately when it comes to Bitcoin, it's the sats that are the standard. It's the sats that are the fundamental unit. Right now we're in this weird period where we have these collections of sats, 100 million sats called Bitcoins, and in the future, far future, perhaps people will be talking in cents of a sat or a tenth of a sat, like I said earlier. You know, perhaps that becomes their unit bias in the future. And ultimately, the difference with Bitcoin and everything else is that, like the metaphor I've given before of how Bitcoin is like the Mona Lisa, and there's the defined frame for Bitcoin, and the number is irrelevant. Numbers are relevant. It's just helping us understand the conceptualization of it. And since it's infinitely divisible, it doesn't matter how much you divide the Mona Lisa into. Ultimately, it's still finite. You could talk about the Mona Lisa's size in terms of square miles or square meters or square centimeters or square millimeters or the Planck length. You know, you can define the size of the Mona Lisa in any unit you want. And if you want to make it sound like more or less, you just define what your length of measure is. It's very similar with Bitcoin. And the important thing to understand about Bitcoin is not the numbers themselves, but the idea of digital scarcity. That's the idea that really matters. And that's what other stocks or altcoins or whatever you want to call them miss, is that they try to convince people, they try to deceive people in thinking that they're more valuable because their unit bias is lower, when in reality, the value is the digital scarcity in of itself. The value in the Mona Lisa, or the value in pricing the Mona Lisa, is not in terms of the X, Y, or Z number of units of measure. It's that it's finite. It has a frame. There is a definitive point where it is and it is not. And it's the same with Bitcoin. It solved the double spend problem. It has that digital scarcity. If it was an invention, it could be invented upon and improved upon into the future and replaced by future technology, similar to a Model T versus a modern sports car. But because it is the discovery of digital scarcity, that means that it cannot be reproduced. Because if you create digital scarcity and you reproduce it, see the problem there? you undermine the whole point. Bitcoin fixes the double spend problem. And if you can duplicate Bitcoin, aka ruin the solution to the double spend problem, well then it was never a solution in the first place. And that's a beautiful thing. Bitcoin's been around for 14 years now, and it continues to march on, it continues to survive as this Mona Lisa that over time we are going to divide into smaller and smaller and smaller units as it absorbs more and more productivity, as it absorbs more and more wealth. And ultimately that's a beautiful thing, that it's never too late to buy Bitcoin, because no matter how much of that Mona Lisa you buy, how much of that Bitcoin you buy, it will always be exchangeable for more productivity in the future versus fiat, where governments and politicians and human beings distort fiat currencies and distort our unit buys and take advantage and hijack our brains to help us thinking we're getting richer and richer. Oh, my house is $300,000 today. 20 years ago it used to be $80,000. I must be richer. It's like, no, your unit bias was hijacked. And most people are yet to realize this. Most people are yet to understand the own limitations of their psychology. And I think when people do, more and more will understand that they should go to Bitcoin. So this video is just over 21 minutes. I think that's a good place to stop.